What happened to Mark Roth? He went from dominating the tour year after year to struggling to even make telecasts. From the mid to late 70s, he was winning multiple titles yearly with ease, but by the mid 80s, his career had taken quite a dive, and after winning 2 titles in 87, he wouldn't win again until 95, which would be his final title. So what exactly went wrong? Why were the 80s and 90s less kind to Roth? And how is it possible that he fell off the map given how talented he was? That's exactly what I will be discussing in this video. Let's start by looking at his career from the very start, and his first win came in 1975. After that, he settled into the tour very quickly and just went crazy, winning titles with ease. From 75 to 79, he won 22 titles, which is just mind-blowing. He completely dominated the tour, but believe it or not, there was one player who won more than him in the 70s, and that was of course Earl Anthony. Earl won 32 titles, and obviously he was just in a different league to everyone, so we'll leave him out of the comparison because really I just want to focus on comparing Roth to the rest of the field. Don Johnson won 17 titles in the 70s, and apart from that, the next nearest was Johnny Petraglia, Larry Larb and Dick Ritka with 12 titles, so clearly Roth was head and shoulders above everyone else on tour bar Earl Anthony. The reason for that was simple. He was known as the original cranker for a reason. He brought power to the game that we simply had not seen before. He was able to hook the ball far more than anybody else because of course back in the 70s we saw plastic balls becoming the norm, replacing rubber ones, so it was still very much a focus on accuracy rather than revs and hook potential. Roth changed that. He was so far ahead of the majority of his opponents that it was almost like an unfair advantage. It's a similar scenario to what we had with two-handed bowlers when they first came onto the scene. But as the 80s rolled around, things started to change for him, and yes, he did still win 11 titles in the 80s, but that is still quite a drop-off from the previous decade, and particularly by 1985 is when the decline was most evident. So what happened? Well, firstly, the most important thing to note is the introduction of urethane bowling balls. They came onto the tour in the early 80s, around 1981, and essentially what that did is took away a lot of the advantage that Roth had in the 70s. It allowed players to start to hook the ball more, and of course Roth had to learn how to use urethane himself, and there was definitely an adjustment period for him and the other players on the tour as well. Also, the 80s saw a number of young, very talented players who all had basically the same, if not more, power than Roth did. Guys like Pete Weber and Amleto Monticelli were the new power players on the scene, and they did eclipse Roth in terms of power and rev rate, especially as Roth was starting to age by that point. It was these two factors that suddenly not only took Roth's edge away, but the entire field was basically able to catch up to him due to the introduction of urethane. And this is why by the late 80s, these new stars had started to emerge. When the crankers like Roth emerged in the mid-70s, the strokers of the time were pushed out. They couldn't compete, but the same thing happened to the crankers by the mid-80s. Suddenly, they couldn't really compete with the new pros who were using urethane and had even more power than they ever did. The ones who didn't adapt, unfortunately, fell off. Every season for Roth from 75 to 79 was pure dominance. But in the 80s, yes, he did have good seasons, but the titles started to become more sporadic. For example, he did win 3 titles in 1984, but then had a 3-year drought until 1987. We've established why the beginning of the 80s saw Roth's dominance start to fade, but what happened after 1987? I think Roth never fully settled into the urethane era. I think he did struggle at times to adapt, especially when the field got even tougher in the late 80s. However, one main factor we need to mention is his age. He was born in 1951, which meant by the late 80s he was approaching 40. Now, over the last 20 years, we've seen that age doesn't particularly matter in bowling. There's been so many players who have shown that they can dominate in their 40s, even early 50s, but what we're talking about is a very different time. players back then weren't so focused on their fitness levels and conditioning just wasn't considered. Roth himself had a number of injury issues. Unfortunately, that was because of the nature of how he threw the ball. He put a lot of pressure on his body. He had on-off tendinitis in his right wrist and was told that he might need surgery. He was having trouble standing on his right foot, so he had surgery to remove a nerve inside it in 1990. And he also had quite a few issues with his thumb, caused mainly by his grip and how he released the ball. Essentially, he was putting so much effort into his swing and his release, and with the way he threw the ball, it was just too much for his body in the end. And the other players that were up and coming were just able to generate more power in a much smoother way. Another factor that I think impacted Roth's career was that he actually bought a bowling alley in 1984. It's quite possible and understandable that this took up a lot of his time, and it could have been a bit of a distraction for him, because it's a bit of a coincidence that after winning titles in 1984 that he then went on a 3-year drought right after he bought a bowling alley. By the early 90s, things were no better for Roth. Reactive resin bowling balls were now making their way to the tour, and this was just yet another change that he had to adapt to. The game had now totally changed from when he was dominating in the 70s, and his health and fitness were nowhere near the levels needed for him to compete. However, by around 1993, he apparently did start to really try and get himself into some better shape. He spent 2 years losing weight. And tried to start getting himself fit and healthy, and it clearly paid off as he won his final title in 1995. But just imagine if he started to do that in the early 80s. His career could have been totally different. I think by the late 80s, because of the injuries and his other responsibilities, he had let himself go a fair bit. And even though he did bounce back, it was essentially too late by that point, as he was 44 years old. He was really past his prime and no longer able to compete consistently in the reactive era with all the new players who were now on tour. It would have been very interesting to see what the mid-80s to 90s could have looked like for Roth if he'd been healthy. But even though the end of his career wasn't quite how he would have liked, there are a lot of positives. Firstly, he went out with a bang, winning that final title in 95, but also he still had a decent decade in the 80s despite all the injuries and the changes in the game. 11 titles in that period is still very, very good. It just wasn't the same Roth that we saw dominate. When you consider that he essentially only had 12 years in his prime, it's an amazing, almost unbelievable achievement that he won 33 titles in that period. He revolutionized the game and did things his opponents couldn't match. He really did set the standard for what bowling has now become. Those 5 years in the 70s were just incredible, and a lot of this was bad timing. If he'd perhaps had a full 10 years in the 70s using plastic, well, he could have won a lot of titles. He could have easily won 40 titles in the 70s alone. So it did come down to timing, but also health was a big factor, as I've mentioned too. But however his career ended up, you cannot deny that Roth was one of the best to ever play the game and really did pave the way for the modern game. And so that will bring us to an end of this video. I hope you all enjoyed this one, and if you have, I'd really appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel. If you've liked this video and you'd like me to do something similar for other players, let me know your suggestions in the comment section below. Well, that's going to do it from me for today, and as always, thank you bowling fans, and see you all next time.